The story of the Gilgo Beach murders is one that has haunted Long Island, New York, for over a decade, leaving behind a trail of unsolved mysteries and a community gripped by fear. This case began in 2010, when a routine search for a missing woman turned into a discovery that would change everything. On December 11, 2010, a Suffolk County police officer was driving along Ocean Parkway, just east of Gilgo Beach, when he decided to search the area for a missing woman named Shanann Gilbert. What he found instead would turn a missing persons case into something much darker. As the officer scoured the area, he came across a set of human remains scattered along the side of the road. At first, he thought he had discovered the body of Shanann Gilbert, but upon further inspection, it became clear that he had stumbled upon something far more sinister. The remains did not belong to Gilbert, but rather to another victim. As the police continued to search the area, they uncovered more remains, revealing a series of murders that had gone unnoticed for years. Over the next several weeks, the discovery of more bodies in the same area became a chilling reality. The remains of at least 10 individuals were found in the vicinity of Gilgo Beach, sparking one of the most haunting investigations in New York's history. The location itself, Gilgo Beach, became a central figure in the mystery. This stretch of land along Long Island's South Shore, known for its picturesque beauty, had long been a place for tourists and locals to escape the pressures of daily life. However, beneath the idyllic surface of the beach, a dark truth was unfolding. The area was isolated, with vast stretches of desolate marshland and dunes, making it an ideal place for a killer to dispose of bodies without being noticed. The discovery of these bodies brought attention to a region that had been previously overlooked, and in the years that followed, the investigation would reveal a chilling pattern of murder and secrecy. As investigators began to piece together the evidence, they discovered that the victims were primarily women, many of whom had been working as escorts or in the sex trade. This information led to speculation that the killer was targeting these women, but the lack of clear motives and the nature of the killings only added to the complexity of the case. It was not just a single murder, but rather a series of connected deaths that pointed to the possibility of a serial killer operating in the area for years. Each new discovery brought more questions than answers, as the investigation seemed to unravel a darker side of Long Island that few were prepared to confront. In the following days and months, the case would captivate the nation's attention, with media outlets around the world covering the mystery. The mystery of the Gilgo Beach murders raised questions not only about the identity of the killer but about the community in which these women had lived. As authorities worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, the residents of Long Island were left to grapple with the unsettling realization that a killer had been hiding in plain sight for so long. The case would go on to become one of the most perplexing and haunting unsolved mysteries in modern American crime history. The discovery of the remains at Gilgo Beach was just the beginning of an investigation that would take years to unfold. As more bodies were found, it became clear that these were not isolated killings but part of a much larger and more complex series of murders. In total, the remains of 10 victims were discovered along a stretch of Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. The bodies were scattered over several miles of land, with the victims all showing signs that they had been discarded in a similar fashion. What investigators discovered, piece by piece, was a chilling narrative that would shape the investigation for years to come. As the investigation continued, it became apparent that the victims shared several key characteristics. Most of them were women, and many had ties to the world of sex work, particularly escorting. The killer seemed to target women who were vulnerable, often working in the sex industry to make ends meet. These women were from all over the United States, some even from as far away as California. They came to Long Island for various reasons, but it seemed as though their lives intersected at the same tragic fate. One of the most haunting details of the case was the discovery that the women had likely been killed elsewhere and then dumped along the desolate stretch of road. It was as if they were being discarded like garbage, with little regard for their lives. Among the first victims identified was a woman named Melissa Barthelemy, a 24-year-old escort from the Bronx. Her remains were found in the same area as the others, and her disappearance had been the catalyst for the search. She had been missing for over a year before her body was discovered, and her case quickly became one of the most high-profile in the investigation. Another early victim identified was Megan Waterman, a 22-year-old from Maine who had also been working as an escort. Her body was discovered alongside the remains of several other women, and like the others, she had vanished without a trace before being found in the desolate area near Gilgo Beach. As the victims were identified, it became clear that there was a pattern emerging. The killer seemed to have a specific type of victim in mind, and his method of operation was strikingly similar in each case. The bodies were often wrapped in burlap sacks, and the women had been strangled or suffocated. Some had been bound with restraints, while others showed signs of being tortured before their deaths. This attention to detail suggested that the killer was not only organized but had a specific method for disposing of his victims. He was not in a hurry, taking the time to carefully conceal the bodies and cover his tracks. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the lack of any obvious motive. While the killer seemed to have a preference for sex workers, there was no indication that he was targeting them for any particular reason other than their vulnerability. In some ways, the killer's choice of victims seemed to reflect a deep-seated hatred of these women, but the lack of a clear motive left investigators grasping at straws. Was this the work of a serial killer with a personal vendetta, or was the killer simply someone who viewed these women as disposable? The questions were endless, and the investigation only seemed to deepen the mystery. The case also raised questions about the role of law enforcement in the investigation. Despite the discovery of the bodies, the case seemed to stall in its early stages. Investigators had few leads to follow, and the killer remained elusive. There were no witnesses, no clear forensic evidence, and no direct connections between the victims and any potential suspects. The lack of progress led to frustration among the families of the victims, who demanded answers. They wanted to know who was responsible for the deaths of their loved ones, and they wanted justice. As the investigation continued, more bodies were found, and the case grew even more complicated. The search for the killer stretched across state lines, and authorities began to look into other similar cases that might be connected to the murders. The question on everyone's mind was, who was the killer of Gilgo Beach, and why had he chosen this desolate location to carry out his gruesome acts? The search for answers would take years, but the haunting discovery of these bodies marked the beginning of one of the most perplexing and chilling true crime stories in recent history. As the investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders deepened, it became evident that the victims were not random, they were linked by a disturbing pattern. Each of the women found near Gilgo Beach had been working as an escort or in the sex trade, and this shared background painted a chilling portrait of the killer's choices. Investigators soon realized that these women were not just victims of circumstance, they were being targeted. But why this particular group? Why these women in particular? The connection between the victims pointed to a larger, more complex story. Many of the women were from out of town, having come to Long Island for various reasons, mostly related to their work in the escorting industry. For example, Megan Waterman, one of the victims, had been living in a motel near the beach when she disappeared. She had been advertising her services online, making her an easy target for someone who was looking for vulnerable women. Melissa Barthelemy, another victim, had been a regular on the escort circuit in the Bronx before her life ended tragically on Long Island. Like the others, her life had been in flux, and she had come to Long Island hoping to find better work, but instead, she met an untimely death. This connection among the victims drew attention to the possibility that the killer may have been targeting women in the sex trade for a specific reason. It was a tragic reality that these women were often more vulnerable than others, facing challenges that put them at risk of becoming victims of violence. The lack of stability in their lives, their transient nature, and the secrecy of their work made them ideal targets for someone who wanted to commit murder without drawing attention to themselves. Yet, this insight only raised more questions about the killer's motives. Was he specifically targeting sex workers because of their profession, or was there something deeper at play? Some theorized that the killer harbored deep resentment for women in the sex trade, viewing them as disposable. This line of thought suggested that the killer's motivations were not just about opportunistic violence but about a deeper, almost personal hatred. However, others believed the killer may have been using the sex industry as a cover for his activities, taking advantage of the fact that these women's disappearances would likely go unnoticed for longer than those of other members of society. It was possible that he viewed them as objects to be discarded once he had no use for them. But the fact that many of the victims were strangers to Long Island and had come from various parts of the country suggested that the killer was not necessarily familiar with his victims beforehand. This raised the possibility that he was a local who frequented the same areas where these women worked, taking advantage of his familiarity with the region. The idea that the killer knew the geography of the area well, particularly the isolated stretches of Ocean Parkway, further reinforced the notion that he was comfortable in this environment and knew how to hide his crimes in plain sight. As the investigation continued, investigators began to delve into the backgrounds of the victims to see if there were any common threads beyond their involvement in the sex trade. They discovered that many of the women had come from troubled backgrounds, with some having histories of addiction, abuse, or unstable home lives. These struggles were often compounded by the work they did as escorts, which carried its own set of dangers. While this information provided some context for the victims' lives, it did little to explain the mind of the killer. Who was this person who preyed on vulnerable women, and what drove him to commit such heinous acts? The police also began to look into the possibility that there was more than one killer operating in the area. The bodies of the women had been disposed of in similar ways, but the investigation suggested that there might be subtle differences in how the killings were carried out. For example, some victims had been bound with ropes or other restraints, while others had been left in a more disorganized manner. The small variations in the crime scenes led some to wonder whether the murders were the work of a single killer or if multiple killers were operating in tandem. This theory, however, only added to the confusion, as investigators struggled to piece together the puzzle. The idea that the killer may have been targeting sex workers while chilling also underscored a larger societal issue: the marginalization of certain groups of people, particularly women in the sex trade. These women often faced an uphill battle for recognition and respect, and their disappearances were sometimes met with indifference or neglect by both the public and law enforcement. It was possible that the killer had taken advantage of this systemic failure, knowing that the chances of being caught would be lower if his victims were not mainstream members of society. With each new discovery, the investigation grew more complex. The victims, while connected by their work, each had their own individual stories, and the killer seemed to have chosen them for reasons that were still unclear. Were they simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was there a more sinister plan at play? Investigators were no closer to finding answers, and the families of the victims continued to hold on to hope that one day the killer would be brought to justice. The investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders was complicated not only by the nature of the crimes but also by the sheer scale of the task that lay before law enforcement. The bodies of 10 victims were discovered across a large area, with each set of remains scattered in different locations along Ocean Parkway, near Gilgo Beach. As the bodies were uncovered, it became increasingly clear that the killings were not isolated incidents but rather part of a larger, more disturbing pattern. While the victims had been killed over a period of several years, the lack of immediate connections between the cases left investigators with few clues to follow. The fact that the killer had seemingly chosen such a remote and desolate location to dispose of the bodies made it all the more difficult for law enforcement to make progress. The investigation began with a simple missing persons report, but as more bodies were discovered, it quickly became clear that something much darker was at play. As police scoured the area and pieced together what little evidence they had, they were faced with a grim reality. A serial killer was at work, and the search for the perpetrator would be anything but straightforward. Each discovery brought with it more questions than answers, and the investigation was bogged down by a number of challenges that made it hard to pinpoint the identity of the killer. One of the major hurdles that law enforcement faced was the lack of physical evidence linking any of the victims to one another. Unlike some serial killers, who leave behind clear signatures or consistent patterns in their crimes, the Gilgo Beach killer seemed to be careful and methodical in his approach. The victims were killed in similar ways. Many had been strangled or suffocated, and their bodies were disposed of in a similar fashion. Yet, despite these similarities, there was no clear indication of a direct link between the victims or any physical evidence that could tie the murders to a single perpetrator. The investigation was also complicated by the fact that the victims came from different backgrounds, lived in different parts of the country, and had different personal circumstances. Some of them had ties to the sex trade, while others did not. This diversity made it difficult for investigators to develop a clear profile of the killer or determine what motivated him. Some of the victims had been working as escorts or prostitutes, while others had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The complexity of the case deepened with each new discovery, as investigators struggled to determine whether the killings were part of a larger trend or isolated events that had somehow been connected. Despite these challenges, law enforcement continued to dig into the case, following up on leads and trying to make sense of the small pieces of evidence they had. As the investigation progressed, the police began to consider the possibility that the killer had been living in or near Long Island for some time. The area around Gilgo Beach, with its isolated and desolate stretches of land, seemed to offer the perfect setting for a killer to operate undetected. This theory led the police to focus on local suspects and potential witnesses who may have seen or heard something suspicious in the area. In the years following the initial discoveries, the case took many twists and turns, with new leads emerging and old ones being revisited. The investigation would become a marathon, with law enforcement working tirelessly to uncover the truth. But despite their efforts, the killer remained elusive, slipping through the cracks of the investigation time and time again. Each time the police thought they had a breakthrough, it would turn out to be a false lead, and the case would once again return to the drawing board. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the lack of cooperation from the community. Despite the fact that the killings were occurring in a relatively small, tight-knit area, there were few witnesses who could provide helpful information. The remote nature of Gilgo Beach, coupled with the fact that many of the victims had been working in the sex trade, meant that there was little public attention on the case early on. In some ways, the killer had taken advantage of the isolation of the area and the vulnerability of his victims to carry out his crimes without raising suspicion. Another challenge for investigators was the limited forensic evidence left at the crime scenes. While the bodies had been carefully hidden and placed in burlap sacks, there were few clues that could lead the authorities to the killer. The lack of clear DNA evidence or physical markers at the crime scenes made it difficult for law enforcement to identify the perpetrator, and the case quickly grew cold. Despite this, the police refused to give up. They continued to investigate leads, interview potential witnesses, and gather any evidence they could find, no matter how small. The frustration of the victims' families grew as time passed without any answers. The families of the women who had been murdered were desperate for closure, and they pleaded with law enforcement to bring the killer to justice. The case became more than just a criminal investigation. It became a symbol of the systemic issues surrounding the treatment of women, especially those in the sex trade. Many of the victims' families believed that their loved ones were overlooked or dismissed because of the nature of their work. As the investigation continued, the public began to ask questions. Why had it taken so long for the police to connect the dots? Why had these women been targeted in the first place? In the end, the case of the Gilgo Beach murders became a symbol of the long and often frustrating journey toward justice for victims who had been marginalized by society. The investigation remained open, with hopes of finding the killer still alive, but the answers remained elusive, and the mystery of the Gilgo Beach murders continued to haunt Long Island. As the investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders continued, one of the most disturbing aspects was the possibility that the killings were part of a larger series of unsolved homicides. Investigators began to consider the possibility that the murders at Gilgo Beach were not isolated incidents but rather connected to other unsolved cases in the region. As the victims were discovered and the similarities between the crimes became more apparent, it seemed increasingly likely that the Gilgo Beach killer was responsible for a broader pattern of killings. The search for answers stretched far beyond Long Island, with law enforcement beginning to look at cases in nearby areas that bore eerie similarities to the Gilgo Beach murders. In the months and years following the discovery of the bodies at Gilgo Beach, law enforcement began to investigate whether there were other unsolved cases from the region that could be linked to the killer. Some of the murders were remarkably similar to the ones found near Gilgo Beach, raising questions about whether the same individual was behind multiple deaths. The investigation revealed that there were several other unsolved murders of women that occurred in the surrounding areas, and many of these cases had similarities to the Gilgo Beach murders in terms of the victims' profiles and the method of killing. The possibility of a larger, more far-reaching series of murders was now a prominent focus of the investigation. One of the most significant developments in this line of inquiry came when investigators discovered that some of the unsolved cases from the past few years shared common characteristics with the Gilgo Beach murders. The victims were often women with similar backgrounds, many of them involved in the sex trade or struggling with addiction. The method of killing was also strikingly similar. Some of the women had been strangled or suffocated, and their bodies had been discarded in similar locations. These similarities led law enforcement to believe that the Gilgo Beach killer may have been responsible for other deaths that had gone unnoticed or unresolved. One of the most significant potential links to the Gilgo Beach murders was a case from 1996, in which the remains of a woman were found along Ocean Parkway, not far from Gilgo Beach. The woman's body had been left in a remote area, and her identity remained unknown for years. When investigators began to compare the case to the more recent Gilgo Beach discoveries, they found similarities that could not be ignored. The woman's body had been hidden in a burlap sack, much like the victims found in 2010, and she had been killed in a similar manner. The investigation into this case was reopened, with many speculating that this woman's murder could be linked to the ongoing killings near Gilgo Beach. This discovery led to even more questions. If the same killer was responsible for both this earlier murder and the more recent killings, how long had the murderer been active? Was the killer simply more careful in the earlier years, or had the bodies been hidden in ways that made them harder to discover? Investigators were faced with the grim reality that the killer may have been operating undetected for decades, leaving a trail of bodies across Long Island without anyone realizing the full extent of his crimes. The possibility that the murders at Gilgo Beach were just the tip of the iceberg was a terrifying thought, and it only added to the urgency of the investigation. The more investigators uncovered, the more it seemed that the Gilgo Beach murders were not the isolated crimes of a single individual but rather part of a much larger and more complex pattern of violence. The killer's method of operation, his careful choice of victims, his method of killing, and his ability to hide the bodies, suggested that he was not a mere opportunist but someone who had been planning and carrying out these murders for years. This theory opened up new avenues for investigation, as law enforcement began to look at unsolved cases from across the country that might be connected to the same individual. The search for the identity of the Gilgo Beach killer took investigators to places far beyond Long Island. As they scoured the records of unsolved murders across the United States, they began to see possible connections between the Gilgo Beach murders and cases in other states, including New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and even further afield. Each of these cases had elements that mirrored the Gilgo Beach killings: women who had been strangled or suffocated, bodies left in isolated areas, and similar profiles of the victims. Investigators began to wonder if they were dealing with a serial killer whose reach extended far beyond Long Island. But as investigators connected the dots between various cases, they were also faced with the daunting task of finding concrete evidence to link them together. The similarities between the killings were compelling, but without clear forensic evidence or a suspect, law enforcement was forced to rely on the faintest of clues. Despite their best efforts, the investigation continued to stall, and the families of the victims were left in limbo, hoping for some resolution to the ongoing mystery. As the years passed, the question of whether the Gilgo Beach murders were part of a larger killing spree remained unanswered, leaving the families of the victims, and the public, with more questions than ever before. The realization that the killings could be part of a much larger series of murders brought a new level of urgency to the investigation. With every piece of evidence that emerged, investigators grew more convinced that the Gilgo Beach murders were not just a tragic anomaly but part of a long-running and disturbing pattern of violence. And with each new lead that emerged, the hope for finding the killer, and bringing closure to the victims' families, grew stronger. As investigators worked tirelessly to connect the dots in the Gilgo Beach murders case, one of the most frustrating elements was the elusive nature of the killer. Despite the numerous bodies discovered, the case lacked the definitive forensic evidence that could have led to a breakthrough. The killer had been incredibly careful in his methods, making it nearly impossible for authorities to identify him based on the evidence left at the scene. The fact that the victims' bodies were often disposed of in a similar fashion, wrapped in burlap sacks and left in desolate, isolated areas, suggested that the killer was deliberate and meticulous. But the lack of physical evidence made it challenging to build a clear profile of the killer or even determine how long he had been operating. One of the most critical questions that loomed over the investigation was whether the killer had been active for a long time before the bodies were discovered in 2010. The idea that the Gilgo Beach murders might not have been the killer's first crime seemed plausible, especially given the similarities between these murders and other unsolved cases. Investigators began to wonder whether the killer had been operating under the radar for years, his previous crimes either going unnoticed or simply not connected. The discovery of a 1996 murder along Ocean Parkway, with its striking similarities to the Gilgo Beach murders, only fueled these suspicions. It was possible, if not likely, that the killer had been preying on women for much longer than anyone had realized. One of the more disturbing theories that emerged during the investigation was that the killer may have been someone with an intimate knowledge of the area, particularly the remote stretches of Ocean Parkway where the bodies were found. This theory gained traction as law enforcement began to examine the geography of the region and the difficulty of accessing the bodies without drawing attention. Gilgo Beach and its surrounding areas are remote, with thick marshland and dunes, making it an ideal location for someone who wanted to hide their crimes. The killer seemed to know exactly where to go to dispose of the bodies without raising suspicion, and this led investigators to believe that he was not just familiar with the area but had likely spent significant time there. The more authorities delved into the case, the more it seemed that the killer had been operating with a chilling sense of calm and confidence. His ability to avoid detection for so long was a testament to his meticulous planning and careful execution. Even as the bodies piled up, there were no obvious clues or breaks in the case that would point directly to a suspect. Despite the attention the case garnered in the media, the killer managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. This raised questions about the nature of the killer himself. Who was he, and how had he managed to elude capture for so many years? Some investigators speculated that the killer may have been someone with a law enforcement or military background, given his ability to operate without leaving significant traces behind. Others believed that he may have been a local who had worked in the area for years and knew it well enough to avoid detection. The theory that the killer could be a local, or someone with close ties to the area, became particularly compelling as the investigation progressed. The idea that the killer could have been hiding in plain sight for so long was both terrifying and frustrating for law enforcement. They knew that they were looking for someone who had blended seamlessly into the community, someone who knew how to keep his secrets well guarded. As the investigation continued, law enforcement began to shift their focus to potential suspects. One theory that gained traction was the possibility that the killer was someone in a position of trust or authority, such as a police officer or a member of the community who had been able to manipulate the system to avoid suspicion. This theory was bolstered by the discovery of new leads, including the fact that some of the victims had been in contact with individuals who had connections to law enforcement. While this did not mean that any of the individuals involved were directly responsible for the murders, it raised the possibility that the killer had been able to hide in plain sight for so long by exploiting his position or relationships. The lack of physical evidence left law enforcement with few leads to follow, but they continued to investigate every possible angle. They revisited old cases, checked backgrounds, and examined the lives of individuals who had been in contact with the victims. Each time they thought they were getting closer to a breakthrough, the case would stall, and the investigation would be pushed back to square one. The frustration grew as each new lead appeared to fizzle out, leaving the killer still at large. The case of the Gilgo Beach murders highlighted the challenges of investigating a serial killer who was able to cover his tracks so effectively. The killer was patient, methodical, and seemingly always one step ahead of law enforcement. The investigation became a race against time as authorities desperately searched for a break in the case. With each passing year, the possibility that the killer would be caught seemed to fade, but the hope that justice would one day be served never waned. As the years passed and the investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders dragged on, the lack of progress became a source of deep frustration for the victims' families. The mystery surrounding the killer seemed insurmountable, with few solid leads and no clear answers emerging from the pile of evidence. As investigators continued to comb through old records and re-examine the evidence, they were faced with an unsettling reality. The killer had slipped through their grasp, evading capture for years. The slow pace of the investigation led many to question why the case had remained unsolved for so long and whether law enforcement was missing crucial details that could point to the killer's identity. The lack of immediate breakthroughs created a sense of urgency within the community. The families of the victims, who had been waiting for justice since the bodies were first discovered in 2010, began to speak out more forcefully, demanding that the authorities ramp up their efforts and finally bring the killer to justice. They wanted answers, and they wanted closure. They were desperate for someone to be held accountable for the murders of their loved ones, and they refused to let the case slip into the background. They had lived with the uncertainty for years, and their pain was compounded by the feeling that the killer might never be found. As the investigation continued, new theories began to surface. Some speculated that the killer had been operating for much longer than initially thought, preying on women in the sex trade in different regions of the country before eventually targeting those in Long Island. This theory opened the door to the possibility that the Gilgo Beach murders were not just part of a localized killing spree but were instead connected to a much larger, nationwide pattern of murders. Investigators began to look into other unsolved cases across the United States, searching for similarities in the methods of killing, the victim profiles, and the locations of the bodies. The idea that the killer might have been active in multiple states brought a new sense of urgency to the investigation, and the search for clues became broader and more far-reaching. The case also raised questions about the role of technology in modern investigations. With the advancement of forensic technology, including DNA analysis, it was hoped that new breakthroughs could help connect the dots and lead to the killer's identity. However, despite the use of these tools, the case remained frustratingly cold. Some experts argued that the killer had been careful to avoid leaving behind DNA evidence, which may have contributed to the difficulty in making a connection between him and the bodies. The lack of physical evidence, combined with the fact that the victims had been hidden in remote locations, made the case all the more difficult to solve. It was as though the killer had anticipated every move the investigators would make, covering his tracks with chilling precision. While law enforcement pursued every lead, the case seemed to stall, and the pressure to find answers grew. The passage of time made it even more difficult to identify the killer. As memories faded, potential witnesses disappeared, and critical evidence became harder to trace. Still, investigators refused to give up. They revisited old crime scenes, re-examined witness statements, and followed up on leads that had been overlooked in the past. They knew that the key to solving the case was hidden somewhere in the evidence, and they were determined to find it. One of the most promising developments came in the form of new technology, particularly the rise of genetic genealogy. This cutting-edge method, which uses DNA from distant relatives to trace a suspect's family tree, had become an increasingly valuable tool in solving cold cases. Genetic genealogy had helped solve several high-profile cases, and many believed that it could be the key to cracking the Gilgo Beach murders. By analyzing DNA samples from the crime scenes and comparing them to public genealogical databases, law enforcement could potentially identify distant relatives of the killer and, through them, trace a path to the perpetrator. This new approach offered a glimmer of hope, as it presented an innovative way to close the gap left by traditional forensic techniques. At the same time, there were whispers that the killer might have been a local resident of Long Island, someone who had grown up in the area and knew it intimately. This theory gained traction as investigators began to consider the possibility that the killer had been hiding in plain sight for years, blending in with the community and avoiding detection. The idea that the killer had local ties raised the stakes for law enforcement, as they considered the implications of having a murderer among them for so long. If the killer was a local, he would have had the knowledge of the area and the resources to operate undetected. This theory also made it more difficult for investigators, as it suggested that the killer had been part of the very community they were trying to protect. Despite these theories and new approaches to solving the case, the killer's identity remained a mystery. The Gilgo Beach murders became one of the most high-profile and elusive cases in American crime history, captivating the public's imagination and sparking debates about justice, law enforcement, and the vulnerability of women in the sex trade. The families of the victims continued to fight for answers, and they refused to let their loved ones' deaths be forgotten. Their pain was compounded by the fact that the killer had not only taken the lives of their loved ones but had also left them in a state of uncertainty, with no closure in sight. The Gilgo Beach murders were a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the power of unresolved mysteries. The killer, though elusive, had left a lasting mark on the community and the families of the victims. And as the investigation continued, there remained the haunting question: who was the man behind these chilling murders, and when would justice finally be served? As investigators continued their pursuit of the Gilgo Beach killer, it became increasingly apparent that the case was far from straightforward. While new technologies, such as genetic genealogy, offered a glimmer of hope, there were still many roadblocks that kept the killer's identity hidden. The investigation had stalled multiple times over the years, with numerous leads turning out to be dead ends, and the killer's ability to evade capture seemed almost calculated. For the families of the victims, each passing year without resolution only deepened their sense of loss and frustration. The killer's ability to remain undetected despite the growing pressure from law enforcement, media, and the public was an unsettling reminder of just how carefully planned and methodical his actions had been. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the possibility that the killer had been living in the same community as the victims. The thought that the person responsible for these heinous acts might have been a neighbor, someone who blended in seamlessly with the local population, was both terrifying and haunting. This theory raised several disturbing questions. How many people had crossed paths with the killer without ever realizing it? What could possibly motivate someone to carry out such brutal killings without ever being caught? It also suggested that the killer's sense of invincibility might have been emboldened by the time he had spent hiding in plain sight, avoiding suspicion while continuing his gruesome work. In many ways, the Gilgo Beach murders seemed to challenge the very idea of justice itself. The killer's careful planning and ability to avoid leaving behind any meaningful evidence made it difficult for law enforcement to make any progress. It was as though he had been preparing for the moment when the bodies would finally be discovered, and he had accounted for every detail of his actions. The victims were chosen with chilling precision, and their bodies were hidden in a manner that suggested the killer had no intention of being caught. His ability to evade capture despite the public attention surrounding the case only fueled the growing sense of fear and frustration within the community. The murderer had shown a level of control and patience that made it seem as though he was operating outside the constraints of ordinary human behavior. In the years that followed, the investigation took several unexpected turns. New leads and potential suspects were explored, but they all ultimately failed to provide the breakthrough investigators had been hoping for. The case had become a cold investigation that lacked any new evidence or significant developments, which only intensified the public's fascination with the story. News outlets and documentary filmmakers started to cover the case in greater detail, capturing the public's attention and fueling the speculation about the identity of the killer. For many, the Gilgo Beach murders became a symbol of the difficulties faced by law enforcement when trying to solve cold cases and the challenges involved in uncovering the truth. Despite the lack of significant progress in the investigation, there were occasional breakthroughs that reignited hope among those involved in the case. These moments, though few and far between, kept the investigation alive and prevented it from being forgotten. One such moment occurred when authorities revisited some of the evidence from the original investigation, this time applying new forensic techniques that had been developed in the years since the murders were first discovered. As technology improved, so too did the ability to analyze evidence, and investigators hoped that a new approach would yield results where previous methods had failed. One particularly promising development was the idea that the killer may have been leaving subtle, but crucial, clues at the crime scenes. Investigators began to consider the possibility that the killer had been trying to communicate with law enforcement through his actions. The meticulous nature of the killings suggested that the killer might have been following a pattern or code that only he understood. If this theory were true, it would mean that the investigation had been missing key pieces of the puzzle that could have led to the killer's capture. Detectives started to revisit the crime scenes and re-examine the evidence from this new perspective, hoping that they could find a hidden message or clue that might help them identify the murderer. As the years wore on and the investigation continued, there was an increasing sense of urgency among the families of the victims. They were no longer just hoping for answers, they were demanding them. The pain of not knowing who had taken the lives of their loved ones was compounded by the frustration of seeing the case remain unsolved year after year. Their determination to find justice for the victims was unwavering, and they continued to push for law enforcement to take every possible step in the pursuit of the killer. The lack of resolution left a hole in their hearts, one that could only be filled by the truth. It was clear that, for the families, this case would never be over until the killer was brought to justice. The Gilgo Beach murders became more than just a series of tragic killings. It became a symbol of the fight for justice for those whose voices had been silenced. The families of the victims, the law enforcement agencies involved, and the public at large all became part of a long and painful search for answers. Though the killer remained free, the investigation continued to cast a shadow over Long Island, a reminder of the unanswered questions and the mystery that had yet to be solved. As the case remained open, there was still hope that one day the killer would be found, and that the families of the victims would finally receive the justice they had been waiting for. The investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders, despite numerous setbacks, was far from over. Even as the years passed with no clear answers, law enforcement remained dedicated to solving the case. The discovery of the bodies in 2010 marked a significant turning point, but the process of piecing together the truth was much more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The persistence of the investigators and the continued involvement of the families of the victims ensured that the case remained in the public eye, never fully fading into obscurity. However, this public attention also had its drawbacks, as it put additional pressure on the investigators to deliver results, a pressure that seemed to weigh heavily as time went on. Throughout the investigation, several theories were floated, but none were concrete enough to lead directly to the killer. One of the most prominent theories was that the killer had some sort of connection to the law enforcement community. This theory was based on several factors, including the killer's ability to operate in such a controlled and calculated manner. His apparent knowledge of the area around Gilgo Beach, combined with the fact that the victims had been disposed of with such precision, suggested that he might have had special training or insight into how law enforcement worked. Whether or not this theory held any merit remained unclear, but it added a layer of complexity to the case. If the killer was indeed someone with law enforcement ties, it would explain his ability to avoid detection for so long. It also raised serious questions about whether there was a breach of trust in the local police department. Another theory that gained traction over the years was that the killer was someone who had lived on Long Island for a significant period. Some investigators believed that he might have been familiar with the remote areas surrounding Gilgo Beach, perhaps using his knowledge of the landscape to evade capture. This was particularly compelling because of the nature of the crime scenes. The victims had been discarded in places that required local knowledge to access without drawing attention. The areas surrounding Gilgo Beach are known for their isolation, with dense marshes and dunes making it difficult to navigate, particularly at night. If the killer was a local, it would make sense that he knew the landscape and how to use it to his advantage. However, despite these theories, law enforcement was still left with very few solid leads. The case had gone cold for long stretches of time, with new evidence coming in only sporadically. For the families of the victims, the wait for justice was unbearable. Each passing year without a resolution was a painful reminder of the loss they had endured. Their frustration grew as the investigation seemed to stall, and many of them began to feel that their loved ones' deaths were being treated as less important because of the victims' backgrounds. Many of the women found at Gilgo Beach had been involved in the sex trade, and there were those who argued that their lives had been valued less than others simply because of the work they did. The families rejected this idea, pushing back against any insinuation that their loved ones' deaths should be treated as less tragic. In response to the lack of progress, some families took matters into their own hands, calling on the public to stay vigilant and continue advocating for justice. They launched campaigns and participated in documentaries, hoping that the more attention the case received, the more likely it would be for the truth to come to light. These efforts helped keep the investigation alive in the public consciousness, refusing to let the killer fade into the background. The families worked tirelessly to ensure that their loved ones were remembered not just as victims, but as people with lives, hopes, and dreams that were tragically cut short. They fought for their voices to be heard, even if the authorities seemed to have difficulty finding the answers they so desperately needed. Despite the many years of dead ends and frustrations, there remained hope that a breakthrough was on the horizon. The use of new technology, including genetic genealogy, offered a new avenue for investigators to explore. This method had helped solve other high-profile cold cases, and there was optimism that it could eventually lead to the identification of the killer in this case as well. Genetic genealogy involved searching publicly available databases for distant relatives of the killer, hoping to trace his family tree and eventually identify him through his genetic connections. The process had proven successful in a number of other cold cases, and it gave investigators renewed hope that the Gilgo Beach murders might finally be solved. With this new method, law enforcement was able to revisit old evidence and reanalyze it with a fresh perspective. The DNA samples collected from the crime scenes were cross-referenced with online genealogical databases, which allowed investigators to build a family tree based on distant genetic matches. This technique, though still in its early stages of use in criminal investigations, was proving to be a powerful tool. As more information was gathered and analyzed, investigators began to see potential connections that could ultimately point to a suspect. The technology was still in its infancy, but its potential to solve cold cases was becoming increasingly clear. As investigators continued to use every tool at their disposal, the hope for justice grew stronger. The Gilgo Beach murders had captivated the nation's attention for years, and the ongoing investigation, combined with the tireless efforts of the victims' families, ensured that the case would not be forgotten. The question of who was responsible for these murders was one that remained unanswered, but with each passing day, the possibility of uncovering the truth grew a little closer. The Gilgo Beach murders case, though far from being solved, continued to evolve with each passing year. As investigators pursued new leads and employed cutting-edge technologies, the case remained in the public eye, refusing to fade into obscurity. With every new update, the mystery seemed to grow deeper, as the families of the victims held on to hope that the killer would eventually be caught. As the years went by, the pressure on law enforcement increased, but so did the support from the community and the media. The case had become more than just a series of tragic murders. It had become a symbol of the relentless pursuit of justice for those who had been overlooked and forgotten. One of the most significant turning points in the investigation came in 2022, when Suffolk County Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison announced that they were closer than ever to finding the killer. With the use of new forensic techniques, including advancements in DNA analysis, the department was able to develop a clearer picture of the killer's potential identity. The police had gathered more information, re-examined evidence from previous crime scenes, and identified potential suspects who had been overlooked in the past. It was clear that the case had not been forgotten, and there was a renewed sense of optimism that the killer's identity would soon be revealed. The investigation also gained new momentum after the media, as well as the families of the victims, pushed for more transparency. Families of the women who had been murdered, such as Shanann Gilbert's family, had been vocal in their calls for justice and had worked tirelessly to keep the case alive in the public consciousness. Their persistence not only ensured that the victims were not forgotten but also highlighted the disparities in how cases involving women in the sex trade were handled. Many of the victims had been escorts, and some argued that their deaths had not received the attention they deserved because of the nature of their work. However, the ongoing media coverage, coupled with the family's advocacy, led to renewed efforts from law enforcement to solve the case, regardless of the victims' backgrounds. As investigators honed in on potential suspects, it became evident that the killer's pattern of behavior was consistent across all of the murders. Each victim had been carefully selected, and the method of disposal showed a level of sophistication. While some authorities had theorized that the killer was an opportunist who had targeted women in the sex trade because they were more vulnerable, the evidence suggested that the killer was likely someone who had been planning his crimes over a long period of time. The precision with which he disposed of the bodies suggested that he had spent considerable time in the area around Gilgo Beach, and some investigators even suggested that the killer might have been stalking his victims before deciding to strike. At this point, law enforcement's focus turned to narrowing down potential suspects who had a clear connection to Long Island and who could have had the knowledge and ability to commit such meticulous crimes. While no direct evidence had yet emerged to link any individual to the murders, the investigation was beginning to take shape. Theories about the killer's identity were explored, including the possibility that he was a local man who had been able to avoid detection for so long by keeping a low profile. His knowledge of the area's geography and his ability to keep his crimes hidden in plain sight suggested that he had been living among the community for years, without raising suspicion. One of the key aspects of the investigation was the analysis of the victims' backgrounds. Investigators were able to determine that the women were not randomly selected but were instead chosen based on their work in the sex trade. The victims, who ranged in age and came from different walks of life, had all been vulnerable, often living on the fringes of society. This shared trait suggested that the killer had been specifically targeting women who were seen as disposable by society. This realization led to further questions about the killer's motives. Was he driven by a desire to exert power over these women, or was there a deeper psychological need that motivated his actions? The lack of a clear motive made the investigation all the more difficult, as it became clear that the killer's reasoning may never fully be understood. In the months following the renewed investigation, new evidence emerged that gave investigators hope. Some of the information came from previously overlooked sources, including phone records, eyewitness accounts, and new forensic analysis of the crime scenes. However, despite these new leads, the killer's identity remained elusive. Authorities believed that they were close to solving the case, but there were still many hurdles to overcome. The families of the victims, who had been waiting for years to find out who was responsible for the deaths of their loved ones, continued to hold on to the hope that justice would be served. They had seen their pain compounded by the lack of answers, but they refused to let their loved ones' deaths be forgotten. The case remained open, and while investigators had made significant progress, the killer's identity was still a mystery. The Gilgo Beach murders had become a haunting reminder of the vulnerability of certain women in society, and of the lengths to which law enforcement would go to bring justice to those who had been forgotten. For now, the killer remained free, but the investigation was far from over. With every new piece of evidence, every lead followed, and every breakthrough, the possibility of uncovering the truth grew closer. The hope that one day the families of the victims would finally get the justice they deserved kept the case alive, and it continued to captivate the public's attention. As the investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders unfolded, the community, law enforcement, and the public all held their breath, hoping that a breakthrough would finally come. Over the years, the case had evolved from a simple missing persons report into one of the most infamous serial murder investigations in recent history. Yet, despite the numerous resources dedicated to solving the crime, the killer remained elusive. The mystery of the Gilgo Beach murders had a profound effect not just on the families of the victims but also on the public's perception of serial killings and law enforcement's ability to solve them. By the time 2023 rolled around, the investigation had taken on a new sense of urgency. Advances in technology, including DNA testing and forensic analysis, had revolutionized the way cold cases were handled. However, even with these improvements, the Gilgo Beach case remained unsolved. The killer's methodical nature, his careful disposal of the bodies, and his ability to evade capture for so many years raised chilling questions. How was he able to avoid detection? And what kind of person could commit such heinous acts while remaining almost invisible to those around him? One of the major challenges investigators faced in solving the case was the lack of direct evidence linking the murders. There were no eyewitnesses, and although DNA was found at some of the crime scenes, it didn't immediately lead to any suspects. The lack of concrete forensic evidence made it extremely difficult to build a solid case. The killer had been meticulous in his planning, and it appeared that he had taken every precaution to avoid leaving behind anything that could trace back to him. This precision in planning only deepened the mystery surrounding the case. Despite the setbacks, investigators continued to use every available tool to piece together the puzzle. They combed through surveillance footage, phone records, and financial transactions, hoping to find a connection that could finally break the case open. But with each passing month, the frustration grew. Every lead seemed to turn into a dead end. For the families of the victims, the long wait for justice had taken an emotional toll. They were left with more questions than answers, wondering if they would ever see the day when the killer was brought to justice. In 2023, investigators took another step forward when they publicly revealed that they were focusing on a specific set of potential suspects. The authorities had received new tips and leads that led them to revisit old evidence. For the first time in years, law enforcement officials believed they were closer than ever to identifying the killer. They were now considering the possibility that the killer was someone who had been involved with law enforcement or had deep connections to the criminal justice system. This theory had been explored before, but the new evidence suggested that the killer might have had inside knowledge that helped him evade capture for so long. One of the most significant pieces of evidence in 2023 came from an unexpected source, an anonymous tipster who contacted the police and provided new information about a suspect who had been in the area around the time of the murders. This tip sparked renewed hope among investigators, as it seemed to corroborate several previously overlooked details from the original investigation. While it didn't lead to an immediate arrest, it was a significant step forward, and it reinvigorated the efforts of law enforcement to close the case. As the investigation pushed forward, the public's interest in the Gilgo Beach murders remained high. The media continued to cover the case extensively, with documentaries, podcasts, and news stories shining a spotlight on the ongoing search for the killer. This continued attention helped keep pressure on law enforcement to make progress and provided a platform for the families of the victims to share their stories. For them, the media coverage was both a blessing and a curse. While it kept the case in the public eye, it also reminded them of the pain they had endured for so many years without any resolution. The renewed public interest also led to a surge in donations to victim support organizations and advocacy groups. Families who had lost their loved ones in the Gilgo Beach murders became active in pushing for changes in how law enforcement investigates such cases, particularly those involving women in the sex trade. Many believed that the case had been neglected because of the nature of the victims' lives, and they pushed for greater attention to be paid to such cases in the future. They advocated for more resources to be dedicated to solving crimes involving vulnerable individuals and for better support systems for those working in the sex industry. As the investigation progressed into 2024, the possibility that the killer would soon be caught seemed more likely than ever. But despite the new developments and the renewed sense of hope, the killer's identity remained a mystery. The case continued to haunt Long Island and the families of the victims, with no clear resolution in sight. However, the ongoing efforts of law enforcement and the families to seek justice made it clear that the case would not be forgotten, and the quest for answers would continue until the killer was finally apprehended. As 2024 continued, the hope for resolution in the Gilgo Beach murders case was fueled by new developments in both the investigation and public awareness. The long years of uncertainty were beginning to feel like they were drawing to an end. The case that had plagued law enforcement for over a decade was now closer than ever to being solved. As investigators dug deeper into old evidence, cross-referenced new forensic findings, and applied emerging technologies, they began to see a clearer picture of the killer's possible identity. The work being done behind the scenes was finally yielding tangible results. In a particularly pivotal moment of the investigation, Suffolk County Police were able to piece together critical forensic evidence that had been overlooked or misinterpreted in the earlier stages of the case. They applied new DNA analysis methods, which were more advanced than those used when the investigation initially began. This breakthrough allowed them to refine their understanding of the killer's identity, and the evidence began to point to a particular suspect, a man whose connection to the case had not been fully realized until now. The realization that they had been so close to the killer all along came as both a relief and a haunting reminder of how carefully he had evaded justice for so many years. This new suspect was someone who had lived in the Long Island area during the years of the murders, with some ties to the local community. Investigators had once considered the possibility that the killer was a local, but at the time, the suspect had not been a significant focus of the investigation. Now, however, this man became a central figure, as evidence from several crime scenes began to match his known whereabouts, and connections to the victims started to come into clearer focus. Law enforcement was hesitant to publicly name the suspect at first, but the internal developments created a surge of optimism within the department. As the search for the killer entered this new, promising phase, the families of the victims began to feel a renewed sense of hope. They had waited for so long, often feeling that their loved ones' deaths were being ignored or underplayed because of their background in the sex trade. But now, it appeared that justice was within reach. Their determination and their insistence on keeping their loved ones' cases alive in the media had paid off. The pressure on law enforcement was immense, but the continued public scrutiny was an essential driving force behind the push for progress. Despite the growing sense of hope, the question remained: would the authorities be able to bring this killer to justice before he could flee, or worse, continue his reign of terror? As new information surfaced, it was clear that time was of the essence. Law enforcement had to act quickly to apprehend the suspect and prevent him from disappearing into the background, as had happened with other serial killers in the past. Investigators knew that the killer was likely aware of the increasing attention on the case, and they feared that he might try to flee or otherwise evade capture if given the chance. For the victims' families, the prospect of closure was a bittersweet one. They had lived for years without answers, struggling to understand why their loved ones were taken from them so violently. They knew that no amount of justice would bring their loved ones back, but they wanted something more: accountability. They wanted the world to understand that their loved ones were people, not just nameless victims, and that they deserved to be remembered for who they were in life, not just how they died. The push for justice was not just about solving the case, it was about giving their loved ones the dignity they deserved. As the investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders continued, one thing was clear: this case would never be fully resolved in the way the public might expect. Even with a potential suspect in custody, the years of trauma and pain left behind by the killer's actions would linger long after the investigation concluded. The case had exposed deep-seated issues about how society viewed and treated vulnerable individuals, particularly women working in the sex trade. The public outcry surrounding the case had sparked a larger conversation about the systemic mistreatment of women in these vulnerable positions, and that conversation was far from over. The eventual resolution of the case, if it came to pass, would not erase the legacy of suffering it had caused. The scars left on the victims' families, the community, and society at large were deep, and no amount of closure could change the impact of these crimes. But as investigators closed in on their suspect, one thing became certain. The Gilgo Beach murders would be remembered as a haunting reminder of both the darkness that exists within human nature and the resilience of those who refuse to forget. As 2024 progressed, the case of the Gilgo Beach murders reached its most critical moment. After years of investigation, frustrating dead ends, and countless hours spent piecing together fragments of evidence, law enforcement was finally closing in on the individual believed to be responsible for the deaths of at least 10 women. The process had been long and grueling, and for the families of the victims, the emotional toll of waiting for answers had been immense. Yet, as new evidence came to light, the puzzle was starting to fall into place. The breakthrough seemed imminent, and it appeared that the killer's reign of terror might finally be coming to an end. The suspect, whose name had been withheld from the public, was reportedly connected to the victims through forensic evidence, as well as by his presence in the area around the time of the murders. Investigators had built a solid case against him, with DNA evidence linking him to several of the crime scenes. The news that the killer might finally be apprehended sent shockwaves through the community and across the country. For over a decade, this unsolved mystery had captivated the public's attention, and now, the end seemed near. But for the families of the victims, this moment of closure was bittersweet. The killer's arrest would bring justice, but it would not bring back the loved ones they had lost. No amount of legal proceedings could undo the pain they had endured. As law enforcement prepared to make an arrest, the public eagerly awaited confirmation. The media had followed the investigation closely, documenting every development, and now it seemed like the culmination of years of work was within reach. For the families of the victims, there was a mix of hope and skepticism. They had lived through so many years of uncertainty, with false leads and missteps in the investigation. They were cautious, yet the possibility that they would finally know who had been responsible for their loved ones' deaths filled them with a sense of anticipation. As the case reached its conclusion, one question remained: what motivated this killer? The nature of the crime suggested a deep-seated hatred of vulnerable women, particularly those working in the sex trade. Some experts theorized that the killer had a personal vendetta against women like the victims, while others believed he simply saw them as expendable, choosing them as easy targets. Whatever his motivations were, the brutality of his actions left no doubt that he was a cold and calculating individual. His ability to evade capture for so long only added to the chilling nature of the crimes. The eventual arrest and prosecution of the suspect would bring an end to the chapter of mystery that had surrounded the Gilgo Beach murders. But even as the legal process began, the case continued to raise difficult questions. The investigation into the killer had highlighted systemic issues, particularly the way society treated vulnerable women in the sex trade. Many felt that the fact that these women were largely ignored by law enforcement and the public until they were discovered at Gilgo Beach reflected a broader societal failure. The case underscored the need for greater attention to be paid to marginalized individuals, particularly women who worked in industries that left them vulnerable to exploitation and violence. As the trial began, the victims' families were prepared to face the man who had taken their loved ones from them. For them, this was not just about securing a conviction. It was about ensuring that their loved ones were remembered for who they were, not just for how they died. They were determined to see their loved ones' stories told, to honor their lives, and to ensure that their deaths were not in vain. In the courtroom, the families would have a chance to confront the man responsible for their pain and seek a sense of justice that had been long denied. The Gilgo Beach murders case would forever be a haunting reminder of the darkness that can exist within communities and the persistence required to bring such darkness into the light. The families of the victims, who had fought so long for answers, would finally see justice served, but the scars would remain. The investigation had brought the killer to justice, but it had also exposed deep flaws in how society viewed and treated those most vulnerable. While the case may have come to a close with the identification and arrest of the killer, the work to address these issues would continue. In the end, the Gilgo Beach murders would remain a tragic chapter in the history of Long Island, marked by lives cut short, families left behind, and a killer who thought he could evade justice. But as the trial unfolded and justice was sought, the community could finally begin to heal. For the families of the victims, it was a step toward closure, but the pain of loss would never fully go away. The case was a stark reminder of the dangers faced by those who are often overlooked by society and a testament to the strength of those who refuse to let their stories be forgotten.